Before I introduce Professor Ear, I want to also thank some organizations that have made this talk possible today. First of all, Stan Harsha, who is a member of the Center for Asian Studies Advisory Council, without whom this event would not be happening. But also I want to thank World Denver and the Foothills World Affairs Council for helping make today's talk possible. Professor Ear comes at a time that is quite, I guess, auspicious for the Center for Asian Studies. We are currently engaged in a kind of a Southeast Asian Studies initiative that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and we are featuring a number of events and talks related to Southeast Asia, so this is very timely and germane in that respect. But the center also has a project that we're just initiating on Chinese infrastructure development in both in China and in Southeast Asia as well. And so this is particularly timely in that context as well. Professor Ear moved to the U.S. at the age of 10 after 7 years in France as a Cambodian refugee. And he has a great TED Talk that tells some of that story of his family's escape from the killing fields in Cambodia. He is now an associate professor of diplomacy and world affairs at Occidental College. He holds a PhD in political science from University of California at Berkeley. He has affiliations, appointments, honors, and awards that are too numerous to count. But he is the author of a book titled Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy from 2012. In which he argues that foreign aid has had a negative impact on governance, with a case study in Cambodia, but I think he draws in that book material from many other cases in the developing world as well. But there's a particularly interesting aspect of his argument where he focuses on the rule of law as a particular kind of casualty of international aid. So I'd highly recommend that book for those of you interested in the topic that he's talking about today. To put that argument in less academic terms, I suppose Professor Ear has been an outspoken critic of the enabling role that international aid has played in Cambodia's, quote, kleptocracy cum thugocracy. That's a mouthful for you. He is also the co-editor, more recently, of a book called co-author, of the book called The Hungry Dragon, How China's Resource Quest is Reshaping the World. And that is where a lot of the China focus of his work, continuing critical work in Cambodia, comes into play, with perhaps we can say China as an up-and-coming enabler of governance problems and issues in Cambodia. He is a TED Fellow, and as I mentioned, he has a TED Talk, which I highly recommend you viewing if you haven't already. That was also, I think, the basis of an award-winning documentary that came out a few years ago called The End, Beginning, Cambodia. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sophal here.
I've been giving this talk 3 times now over the last 2 days, so I'm sorry if I sound like a robot at times. America, China, and the retreat of democracy in Southeast Asia, the case of Cambodia. And really, it's if I were to retitle it a bit, it would be China and Southeast Asia, from threat to charm offensive to threat again. And it's really this idea of whether China's going global, which is what the Belt Road Initiative represents, is really a kind of extension of its ability to trade with other nations, but also to encircle perhaps other nations like India, for example, where China has acquired friends like Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan, which all surround India. First, I want to thank a few people, Professors Tim Oakes, Mike Dwyer, Lisa Williams, and the Center for Asian Studies, of course, all of you for being here, and Stan Harsha, most of all, for meeting me in Ubud at the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival and proposing that I come out here to speak. Today is April 18th. It is the day after the 43rd anniversary of the fall of Phnom Penh, which caused the deaths of 1.7 million people, a quarter of the population eventually over the course of 4 years. And so I want to be mindful of the fact that we're talking about a country that has gone through genocide, has seen a lot of killing, including my own father's death and my own wife's father passing. And so I really think that there's nothing that I can frame in terms of how personal this can be, but other than to say that in this talk I hope to at least elucidate some of these points. Of course, China was involved in supporting the Khmer Rouge for that period of time, and I won't get into that, but it's an interesting trajectory in terms of history. I came from, I'm at Occidental College. I joined Oxy in 2014 as part of their fall collection then, just like somebody else who we might recognize, who was a student for 2 years before. We won't talk about where he transferred to, but at least he has fond memories of Oxy. And so before Oxy, I taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, and it's a school for junior military officers who typically have gone to deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan, and have been very good at destroying things, blowing things up. And they've come back to the Naval Postgraduate School, or they've come to the Naval Postgraduate School to learn about nation building, which I have to tell them is not like this. It's not like building a house where you draw a blueprint and the living room, kitchen, bathroom are all planned ahead and a builder comes and makes your plan real. That the work that nation building represents, indeed the work of international development, is much more like gardening as metaphor. And in gardening, local conditions are always different. The soil is different. The weather changes. The locals know when to prune, for example. And the message that I send to them, and I send to my current students now at Occidental College, is to dispense with this illusion of control. So I'll try to share that with you today. Gardeners have no illusion of control. We create the right growing conditions, nurture a healthy soil life, set up our lifestyle so we have time to tend our crops, and we plant a diverse variety of sturdy, healthy plants and watch them grow. We adjust as we go along, removing excess weeds, mulching, watering, and fertilizing when necessary, and picking off pests. But ultimately, the end result almost always includes crop failures and unexpected successes. And we feel more like stewards, sometimes even observers than masters of our domain. So that's really a message that I think is so basic. And I actually would say that this kind of philosophy would serve not just the U.S. military or any kind of person doing work in international development, but I think also the kind of work that's done by China outside, that illusion of control cannot be, is not real. You have to essentially dispense with it. Of course, I sound like the world's best gardener, and I actually do this to my plants, so buyer beware. I am not really great at this stuff either. With that said, let's talk about China and America and the collapse of democracy in Southeast Asia, looking at the case of Cambodia. Take you to January 2017. President Trump signs an executive order withdrawing the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I realize a week ago we were already overtaken by events because on my phone these headlines blew up. Trump tells officials to look at rejoining the TPP. Trump, in reversal, considers rejoining the TPP. But let's say for now there's not any real action. It's just a bunch of tweets or orders of some kind or another. But the TPP, what does it represent? It represents essentially a trade partnership that would have included the U.S. and 11 other nations that have that are in the Pacific area. So why would China not join the TPP? It wasn't as if China wasn't allowed to join the TPP. It was that the terms of the TPP, which included higher standards in terms of environment, labor, and intellectual property, would not have been favorable to China. It would have meant accepting, for example, U.S. patents as legal in China and making sure that other things that China doesn't necessarily want to follow would be followed. So it represented essentially such a high standard that we were sure that China wouldn't join. But then the U.S. didn't join either. Now it's talking about rejoining. But the economic considerations are tremendous in terms of what we're looking at for the U.S. and the Pacific region. 60% of U.S. trade is with the Pacific region. There are Asian maritime and regional security interests that are vital to the U.S. Asian Americans, while only 6% of the U.S. population, account for the fastest growing ethnic group in America. Asians dominate the vast number of foreign students in America. And if you just look at the geoeconomic context of the Southeast Asian region in particular, what do you see? You see a region that's 1.7 million square miles, 618 million people, $2 trillion in combined GDP, and that's from 7 years ago. It's much more now. $3,500 in per capita GDP. If you compare that to China, you've got even bigger numbers. 1.3 billion, of course, in terms of population, 10 trillion or more in terms of GDP, and $7,000 per capita GDP. Now, China, we know, has been getting richer from its ability to trade with the rest of the world. It's amassed a large amount of foreign reserves and capital, and what has it decided to do with that? The One Belt, One Road, or Belt Road Initiative, is the result of a plan to essentially switch away from buying U.S. Treasury bills, as the excess capital from China was traditionally used for, and instead invested by going global. So it has meant, for example, planned investments in ranging from ports in Pakistan and Sri Lanka to high-speed railways in East Africa to gas pipelines crossing Central Asia. It's arguably the largest infrastructure project investment drive of a single country in history. But interestingly enough, if you look at the deals that have been signed of the ones in 2016, 50%, which is an impressive number, are essentially lined up as OBOR deals, but only 12% of those have actually materialized. So it's a far cry from the time that something is announced to the actual reality that something will happen. Lots of stuff gets announced. Not everything gets actually realized. And you've got OBOR even in places like New Zealand. And so the definition of OBOR itself is really very, very broad. It could be the Polar Silk Road, for example. And here you have a well-recognized map of the New Silk Road. What I want to point out is what I mentioned earlier, India, for example. India here is shown as simply, there's nothing happening much there except for Calcutta, but Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Nepal are all countries that have now aligned with China in terms of OBOR, and it represents actually a kind of encirclement of India. Since China considers India a future competitor, by 2040, India's GDP is projected to be the second largest and really a rival of China. The goal of BRI, Belt Road Initiative, is really one that's I have to say brilliant. It's a win-win-win-win for China in so many ways, and you could probably add a few more wins. But excess Chinese capital, which China has plenty of, is invested through these loans, for example, in infrastructure. Some of the requirements are no tender process, so no tendering other than to Chinese firms. So it's a win for the capital that they had sitting around that wasn't doing much, so they get to send that abroad. The Chinese firms win the contract because it has to be a Chinese firm by agreement. And then they employ Chinese workers who, of course, are mostly men because there is already a demographic sort of bulge of too many men in China from the what we know to be the sex selection of preference of Chinese families. And so maybe some of them might find spouses while working abroad, which is a personal win for them too. So a win-win-win, certainly. And if things go wrong in terms of a country that receives, that takes out a loan and is unable to pay for it, China has now a precedent of having swapped in terms of doing a debt equity swap. So switching the loan into essentially stock, which allows it to then own the infrastructure. That happened in Sri Lanka with a maritime port in which China essentially then forced a 99-year lease. And now 99 years is exactly the number of years that Hong Kong was given to the United Kingdom, where you see here the deal for that port in particular, and the actual check, like a lottery check, of $292 million for the Sri Lanka Port Authority. Now, the implication of something like that are not just economic. While, of course, people living near the port are not happy about this, because there's also land near the port that was designated as part of this deal. It also means that China is then able to request, for example, a submarine visit to the port, which it did in 2014. Even though the port was handed over in 2017, it requested again in 2017, but was declined. But you can see that a port for maritime commercial purposes could easily turn into a naval port for other military purposes. Now, aside from maritime ports, there's also in Sri Lanka, as it happens, the world's emptiest airport, which is 10,000 square feet, and was built in the same area. So this is it looks like the province of the former president of Sri Lanka. I suppose they were currying favor with him, and he said, let's have this airport built there. So it was built there, but only 2 airlines operate out of this airport. It costs hundreds of millions, I think about $300 million to build on Chinese money, but hasn't really produced the economic impact that were hoped. It's not just roads, bridges, empty airports, and ports that are, there's also private investment in high-rise condos, and that offers opportunities for Chinese private citizens to make money from those investments, or perhaps to launder money that they have ill-gotten. In Cambodia, for example, Diamond Island is one such place where a lot of high-rises have suddenly appeared. And this is a country that, I mean, never had anything more than, for a long time, 10 or 20 stories high. So suddenly you've got all these buildings, this boom, and this particular one here called The Bridge is one such Chinese project. It's already almost fully purchased by mostly Chinese investors, who in turn will leave it empty because after having purchased it, they simply, it's an asset that they want to keep and not actually do anything with. So it gets snapped up, it leaves, it's left empty, it drives up real estate prices, and I think it's a problem that's been true in China in the characterization of ghost cities. So houses are built to be inhabited, not for speculation, Xi Jinping has said. And I think he meant that, of course, for China, but it certainly applies for Cambodia, where Chinese investments in building up a real estate bubble has really caused, I think, a lot of speculation. In February 2009, Xi Jinping was then vice president, went to Mexico and spoke to a group of Chinese investors there. He said there are few foreigners with full bellies who have nothing better to do than to point their fingers at our country. China does not export revolution, hunger, poverty, nor does China cause any headaches. Just what else do you want? I think it's really characteristic it's a moment of clarity in which we can see sort of the thinking behind some of this Xi Jinping thought. And actually, I would say the export revolution part is very interesting because right now in Cambodia, the big debate, or what the Cambodian government has characterized as an attack on itself, is so-called color revolutions that it claims the West is trying to implement in Cambodia. So you can see the export revolution suddenly in Cambodia, color revolutions being blamed as the real evil from the West. Of course, it's not just infrastructure. There's also trade that is flowing out of all this, and that's the whole point of OBOR. But even before OBOR, the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement combined essentially the populations of China and ASEAN into a 2 billion person market with $452 billion traded in 2016 and possibly $1 trillion by 2020. 90% of ASEAN exports to China are tariff-free. So you can already see that the basis of this type of free trade agreement is to lower tariffs. It's not to necessarily elevate standards in terms of labor and environment. From ACFTA to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, That's the next level. This is China's answer to the TPP. When China knew that it could not join the TPP because of the standards that were required of membership, it created RCEP to kind of encompass all of the ASEAN member countries and to create a kind of blanket around them. So here you have RCEP countries, so all of ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, China, India. And then you have the TPP, which does not currently include the United States, but includes 11 countries, 4 of which are part of ASEAN. In terms of the trade volume, if the U.S. does return, it would represent 38% of global GDP versus RCEP 28%. Share of global trade 40% for TPP versus 29%. But of course, population-wise, with China, you've got 50% of the world's population when combined with all those other countries versus only 11%. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this idea of soft power. Who here has heard of soft power? Soft power, yes. So what is soft power? What is soft power?
Let me see. Trying to exert influence through, for example, through cultural.
Exactly, yes.
factors.
Not through money or like
Right.
buying people or forcing them with a gun to follow you. Soft power is to influence by persuasion rather than coercion. And actually the original definition by Joe Nye of Harvard was that it's very narrow. It doesn't even include investment, aid, formal diplomacy. So OBOR would be completely not soft power. But you can relax the definition to include money, certainly, and it can be targeted high elites or low to the broader public. But examples would be Hollywood, making Hollywood movies being a kind of projection of American values where people abroad can watch Hollywood movies and then aspire to have more American sort of lifestyles and so on. K-pop from Korea, for example, being very popular throughout Asia and the US. But for China, this hasn't been the case. They don't have like their version of K-pop that's penetrating other countries yet. But in Cambodia, they do have the largest Chinese language school outside of China, 15,000 students at this school, which is really very telling about how much Cambodia is trying to integrate its sort of population in how China could do business then in Cambodia. Now, this is how critics of this whole relationship have characterized that exchange. It's not with Xi Jinping here. The person who drew this passed away before Xi Jinping came to power. But this is really the kind of trade-off that you're seeing here. The Prime Minister of Cambodia is shown as trying to get into the pocket of China here with its economic aid and donation and then concessions for exploitation of natural resources, which I would say is obviously crude, but summarizes this kind of view that there's an exchange going on. Somebody is getting something, the other side is getting something as well, and that this kind of there's something left unsaid, which is that the people, of course, suffer as a result of all this. In 1999, China built for Cambodia a new Senate building. Actually, it's a brand new Senate because there was an election that year and a bunch of politicians couldn't find a job, so they created a Senate for them, and so they needed a place to go to, so they had to build a Senate for the new chamber for Cambodia, and it has its own golf range in the back. A decade later, China then went on to underwrite, actually not just underwrite, but build for Cambodia this Council of Ministers building. And you can see the sort of the brutalist architecture here with a pyramid in the middle that was supposed to house the Prime Minister of Cambodia's office in there, a kind of tomb-like structure, which he didn't like. He said feng shui was not good for this. And then instead, he had another building built, which is of similar architecture. But the Chinese, of course, built it on a 24/7 schedule of Chinese workers coming in multiple shifts and had it done very quickly. The main, of course, concern for something like that was there were whispers of maybe there's listening devices in this building telegraphing everything that is being said back to Beijing. What did Cambodia give to China in exchange for this? In December 2009, 20 Uyghurs from China ended up in Cambodia trying to get asylum. Now, they were almost at the point where the refugee agency was finished with reviewing their case when the day before Xi Jinping came to sign $1.2 billion worth of deals with Cambodia, they were flown back to China on a chartered plane, which I think tells a lot about, for a country like Cambodia, which has had a lot of refugees sent abroad who have suffered terribly, including myself, that basically it was perfectly willing to send back 20 Uyghurs without a second thought, because of course there's money involved. There's a lot of money involved, $1.2 billion. The U.S. responded to all this by canceling a donation of 200 trucks and trailers that were destined for Cambodia, military trucks and trailers, and the Cambodian government spokesperson said, if the U.S. gives us the equipment, we are happy, and if they won't give it to us, it is also good. So it was certainly a signal, and China, in response to this, instead gave Cambodia 400 trucks and 50,000 uniforms to boot, so that Cambodia could be made whole after its contribution of 20 Uyghurs back to China. So one of the sort of overriding, I think, ideas here is that China and Southeast Asia are kind of like the sphere of influence, right? So it's China's sphere of influence. China's nearest neighborhood is Southeast Asia. And if one can think of the Monroe Doctrine as the sort of equivalent of this, the Monroe Doctrine, of course, called for Latin America, South America to be essentially America's backyard, and no other country should come in and interfere in this. That essentially, if China sees Southeast Asia in this manner, it could be really a disastrous model for the region, because you've got nascent democracies, you have weak civil societies, and it's certainly pushing, as a result of its soft power or actual coercive power, Japan, Taiwan, and even the U.S. out of the region. The point of all this has also been that China has wanted, of course, to have its claim over the South China Sea honored, and ASEAN has has at least 4 members that have claims to the South China Sea. So 4 members out of 10 are claimants to the South China Sea, and others are not. Cambodia is not one of them. But the problem, of course, is that you have an organization like ASEAN that has 10 members facing off against China, which of course is unitary in its approach. So the solidarity of ASEAN really pales in comparison to what China represents. And underneath that South China Sea water is a lot of oil and gas, proven reserves, some have argued, than China currently has in its possession on its own territory. So it would represent certainly a lot of energy, perhaps independence for China to be able to access those resources. Aside from that, there's also maritime resources, fish and other things, and other resources that could be drawn from the South China Sea. So a lot is at stake for those countries in disputing China. But the way that China is able to manipulate ASEAN is really because of a weakness of ASEAN. It was created in a way that essentially consensus is required for any decision. And so any member of ASEAN can essentially veto the decision of the other members, and it only requires one. So that's a real challenge. In 2012, you saw this happen when Cambodia chaired the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. Oftentimes they do these photo ops here. You had actually Hillary Clinton there attending. What in reality often isn't seen behind is the fact that most of these smiling foreign ministers are not actually very happy with one another because they're disagreeing. And sometimes they're disagreeing violently because they're actually in some hot dispute about a temple like Prevahia, for example, which Cambodia and Thailand were essentially fought over for a period of months. In July 2012, what happened was when Cambodia chaired ASEAN, ASEAN itself failed to reach a consensus on handling disputes in the South China Sea. So ASEAN couldn't come up with a final communique, a resolution at the end of its meeting. And it was because Cambodia, essentially, as the group's chairman, rejected a compromise on the wording of the joint communique. For the foreign minister of Indonesia at the time, Marty Nalagawati, he says, "This is strange territory for me. It's very disappointing at this 11th hour ASEAN is not able to rally around a certain common language on the South China Sea. We've gone through so many problems in the past, but we've never failed to speak as one." Well, they did fail to speak as one that time. And in November later that year, a Cambodian government spokesperson told the media that Southeast Asian leaders had decided that they will not internationalize the South China Sea from now on. And what do I mean by not internationalize the South China Sea? It meant that essentially that disputes over the South China Sea would be dealt with between China and whoever claims to have right over that area. So if Vietnam claims to have rights over the South China Sea, it would have to deal with China. And you can just imagine, China versus Vietnam, China versus the Philippines, China versus whichever country is not going to be a very easy fight. But that language is directly from the script of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A Chinese government spokesperson said, "We oppose the internationalization of the South China Sea." So it's literally the same language. And people who observed all this said that China had bought a seat at the ASEAN table courtesy of Cambodia. And what was the price of this? Well, today, in terms of current numbers, $4.3 billion in loans from China to Cambodia. So Cambodia's GDP is about $20 billion. 4.3 over 20 is about 20% of Cambodia's GDP. And if overall debt levels are to be trusted at 32% of GDP, that would represent nearly 2/3 of Cambodia's debt level owed to China. I'm fond of the African proverb: if a man walks and has his hand in another man's pocket, he has to go where that man goes. And that's really what I think is happening with Cambodia in terms of where Cambodia is going. It's going wherever China tells it to go. In 2016, Cambodia blocked mention of a permanent court of arbitration ruling that favored the Philippines over China on the South China Sea. This was yet another really surprising disgrace. Laos was chair at the time of the ASEAN meetings. And to give you a little bit of perspective, Laos was Laos is doing this kind of balancing, bandwagoning that is saying, you know, they're friendly towards China, but they're not married to China. Just as Myanmar was essentially very much in China's pocket, but then decided to open up to the rest of the world and to be friendly towards the United States. Well, Laos had given the U.S. delegation the best hotel in Vientiane to stay in, their best 5-star hotel. And what did they give the Chinese delegation during this 2016 meeting? They gave them no hotel at all. They had to build their own hotel, which I think sent a very strong message about their positioning, right? So when Xi Jinping arrived for this meeting, he arrived in a hotel that had concrete that was literally still drying. And so that is really, that moment in time was when Laos was saying, hey, we want to dance with you, the United States. But then who won the election? Donald Trump did, and then there was no dance. So I'm afraid that Laos is probably back in China's corner at this point. But it's not just China calling the shots. Cambodia is making threats beyond its borders. Even within its borders, the Prime Minister has said that he only needs 7 hours to arrest anyone who criticizes him on his Facebook page. That is the extent of his surveillance capabilities. Earlier this year, a man was wrote on Facebook that called the government authoritarian and was arrested after doing so, which I would argue is the definition of irony, because you call the government authoritarian and they come and arrest you. And that's too bad for this gentleman here. I don't know if he's been released yet, but it's really gone to a new level in terms of threats. The Cambodian Prime Minister threatened to beat up protesters outside ASEAN outside an ASEAN Australia summit in March, and then. The protesters said they weren't planning on burning anything, but now that he mentioned it, it's a good idea. So, you know, they ended up burning his image in effigy. Anyways, he was very unhappy because he wanted to shame Australia because of what he perceived as pressure on political crackdowns in Cambodia. And this is how I think the thinking goes. I mean, you know how in French you say, l'état c'est moi, that the state it is I. So the king confuses himself as his own state, right? The state is the king, right? So here, ASEAN without Hun Sen is not ASEAN. This is literally a kind of understanding that goes beyond the state. It goes into ASEAN is essentially not ASEAN without Hun Sen. And that's because, again, the ASEAN way requires consensus. And if he had decided not to join the meeting and not allow any Cambodian delegates to join, that would have meant that nothing could have been agreed to during this special summit. China's largesse goes beyond ASEAN in Southeast Asia. We know that in Timor-Leste, where Stan and I both worked for a time, this half of an island that used to be part of Indonesia has a large Chinese embassy presence. This is the U.S. embassy, which is part of the governor's, was the former Portuguese governor's mansion or compound. And there used to be tennis courts here, which I played in. Actually, you can kind of see them over there. They weren't as nice, certainly. But China has been building like crazy in Timor. They've provided a new foreign ministry building there, which was finished a few years ago, and then followed that up with a presidential palace. So they're very much into these projects for prestige projects. So you need a presidential palace, you need a Council of Ministers building, you need a Senate building, you need a foreign ministry building. They'll do that. Why are they doing that for Timor? It's the Timor Gap there. There's a lot of natural gas underneath that ocean across from East Timor, and the trench that goes here is some of the deepest waters in the world. You can actually operate, allegedly, a submarine without detection through there. This is all happening in the presence, or rather absence, of American leadership. As we know, as I mentioned from the beginning, President Trump pulled out of the TPP. Democracy is in global retreat. You can see that certainly in the tweets of our own president calling the fake news media the enemy of the American people, which I would remind you, or if you don't know, is language that the Khmer Rouge used. I mean, they called their enemies, they said enemies of the people were anybody that opposed them, and then they ended up tortured and killed, forced to confess to being both CIA and KGB at the same time. You also see that there's been an attack on our network news in terms of licenses being called to bear in terms of wanting to revoke licenses. Of course, that hasn't happened. But what happens in the U.S. often becomes an example for the rest of the world, especially in the less democratic parts of the world. So you'll see that. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But in Cambodia, the media is under assault. Certainly, newspapers have been shuttered. Radio Free Asia has been expelled. Freedom has shrunk in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, actually, I'll talk about this in a second, but the opposition was dissolved. Leaders have been jailed and exiled. In Thailand and Cambodia, the Facebook posts have led to arrest. In Malaysia, a 92-year-old former prime minister is running under the banner of the opposition party and faces as his opponent the current prime minister, who is well known to have been involved in some sort of multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal that is directly linked to him, and it appears that he'll end up probably winning despite all of that. In the Philippines, you have a president who says he killed someone as a teenager, and his spokesperson has to clarify that he thinks the president was kidding, but isn't sure. In China, of course, President Xi's term limits are no longer present, so there is some I suppose, grumbling. So these posters have been observed, Xi forever. The folks who are banning all content that is objectionable have targeted Winnie the Pooh and Tigger as being far too similar to this image here of President Xi and President Obama walking. And I love the fact that even the legs are exactly. I mean, whoever caught this is brilliant. As for my beloved Cambodia, I have to say that it's increasingly looking like a province of China, if not a wholly owned subsidiary. And I don't want to be an alarmist, but there's something really different about this relationship. I think in other countries, perhaps China's relationship is perfectly innocent and does not involve any sort of requests of the sort that have been made of Cambodia or demands. Here, President Xi shaking hands with Prime Minister Hun Sen. There's been the promotion, for example, of Xi Jinping's Governance of China book. It was translated into Khmer by the Cambodian government, and it's being promoted as some sort of blueprint for Cambodia. Here, a senior government official holding an English language copy of the book, which reminds us of a little and red book that used to be also promoted by another chairman or president, a leader of China in the past. Now, China, of course, has had its own issues about freedom of speech. We know that it's strictly limited there. I don't know how many of you have observed this. Anybody familiar with this? Yes? Okay. So the lady in red is, this is at the National People's Congress. There's a press conference, and all these questions are already scripted, and they've all been vetted beforehand. But she's asking this really long question that has been, was translated as such. And the answer was even, it's a sycophantic question. The answer turns out to be even shorter because the guy answering it just doesn't think it's very smart at all. But the lady in blue is rolling her eyes, and that alone causes her to be an internet sensation, with her WeChat transcripts released, and then she's fired. But at least she's very popular as a result of this. The Prime Minister here of Cambodia with the Vice, or with the Foreign Minister of China hugging, which I have to say isn't quite the full-on hug that he did for the Thai Prime Minister Prayut Ochoa, but you know that there it is, and sometimes there's the use of social media by the Prime Minister of Cambodia that is really to promote how accessible he is, how transparent he is. So back in January, a friend of mine shared this Twitter post in which he was, I guess, somebody felt the need to share that he had all these things. I won't read it, but it really is sometimes too much information. Cambodian democracy has been gutted, I would argue. I don't care if the argument is that there's never been democracy to begin with. Of course, you can say that if you want to, that there was no democracy from the beginning, and therefore there's nothing lost. Cambodians are less free to talk today, to speak today, than they were, I'd say, a year ago, or 2 years ago, or a decade ago, or maybe even 2 decades ago. You've got the opposition leader who's been exiled, his replacement imprisoned, his deputy in exile, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs publishing white papers about titled To Tell the Truth, which is a kind of revisionist history of Cambodia since 1990. And the National Democratic Institute, for example, which observes elections in Cambodia, Expelled. Radio Free Asia, I mentioned earlier, Shuttered. And the Cambodia Daily, one of 2 English language newspapers that is essentially the New York Times of Cambodia, shuttered. And now the other one, the Phnom Penh Post, under assault. Now, how did they get shuttered? The Cambodia Daily got a bill for $6.3 million to be paid in 30 days, a tax bill, which of course came out of the blue, non-negotiable. Can you explain how this was calculated? No. So they decided to close instead, and the Phnom Penh Post is currently facing a $4.3 million tax bill. Meanwhile, what happened to the opposition party after the dissolution? The Parliament, the National Assembly, voted to reallocate the seats of the opposition. So the opposition had won almost 45% of the vote, right? So they're in blue here. And so they had all these blue seats here. And a party, a royalist party that won 3.66% of the votes, obtained the bulk of the opposition's seats. So that, I don't understand. I mean, wouldn't you want to have a new election to, settle this matter? But instead, they just reallocated the seats. People have died. Cam Lay here, who was a critic of the government, talked about a global witness report on hostile takeover, which documented some of the corruption happening and how much ownership of the economy was in the hands of the Prime Minister's family. He was killed at a Chevron-owned gas station. But to give room to the regime to explain what the thinking is, I would use this quote from from a 98-page report on color revolutions that the government put out by the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister is quoted in it saying, "Real democracy in Cambodia has not been set back or fallen. Instead, it has been protected and strengthened in accordance with the principle of the rule of law for the great benefit of the people and the nation. Only fake democracy has been abolished." So we are now faced with a situation in which you've got fake news, you've got fake democracy, and so you might as well think of our situation in Cambodia as the equivalent of this here. Words that vaguely remind me of when the Prime Minister kicked a soccer ball a couple of years ago. I don't know if you're able to see where it goes, but it's not pretty. The price to pay has been also personal on my end. I've been speaking out. I've been going to the press when they've asked me to say things. And of all the things that he could have sort of criticized me on, it's very odd. It was actually having to do with a comment I made about Donald Trump, in which I said that Donald Trump was, part of the rise of the know-nothings. He has, if he's elected, it'll be the rise of the know-nothings, and that he's got autocratic tendencies. So in response to that, one day in December of 2016, the Prime Minister said that I wanted to hit his head but missed and hit Donald Trump's head instead. I'm not a professor of diplomacy like Sophal, but I have conducted diplomatic affairs. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs at age 26. And so he said that since Donald Trump won, I should leave the U.S. immediately. But, this is the kind of thinking that goes into, you disagree with somebody, therefore you should become a refugee, which happens frequently in other countries. I won't say which. Now, more recently at APEC earlier this year, he gave a speech to President Trump, and he said, now this was again in reference to that same article. Somebody else had said birds of a feather flock together to kind of link Donald Trump and Hun Sen. And so this was translated as only the same hairy animal can live in the same nest. So really, the translation was terrible, but I do appreciate the attempt there. Then later, he talks about a Cambodian who is a professor in the United States said that if Donald Trump won the election, it would be the era of the rise of the non-human beings, which I was like, what is he talking about? Is it artificial intelligence or apes or something? But it was the rise of the know-nothings. So I guess non-human beings, know-nothings, what's the difference, right? And so he had supported Donald Trump, obviously, for the election. And so anyhow, I'm just a Cambodian professor in the United States. What do I know? I'm happy to take your questions. I know we've gone through a long journey already, and I'm happy to answer anything you might be wondering about.
Thank you.
Well, so you remember the 4.3 billion in loans to Cambodia from China. Japan is about at 1 billion or so. So it's really not anywhere near that, but it's the second most, the second highest country that is loaning to Cambodia. So and most of that money is for obviously infrastructure. So they've definitely tried to compete. But Japan is considered part of the West, and so there's been pressure, of course, to force Japan not to give money for, like, the election, for example, the National Election Committee, because it would essentially support an election that doesn't include the opposition party and would be illegitimate. So there's a lot of pressure on Japan to kind of step in line with other Western countries that have been critical of Cambodia. And look, it's a challenge, right? So if you stop giving money to a country because you feel they're doing the wrong thing, is that good in terms of signals to that country? Yeah, it tells the country you don't like what they're doing. But then, on the other hand, China can just say, great, more for us, and be even more powerful in Cambodia than anybody else, which it already is. I mean, I think that the game is pretty much over. It's just that Japan has had a good, closer relationship than other Western countries to Cambodia's current regime, and so it's able to maybe by being a little critical about what's happening have more of a say, but I doubt that it would be able to trump the China card. It's interesting because the Prime Minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen, he absolutely hated China. In fact, in the 1980s, China was his mortal enemy. He would talk about how anything evil has come out of China, right? So he's a pragmatist in the sense that he then turns around by the late 1990s and says, okay, we're going to support the one China policy, and we're going to start taking money from China. We're going to kick out the Taiwan representative office, but we'll still take money from Taiwan. No worries about that. We'll take their investment money. It's just that he was able to, I think, he's able to do business with China because he's a reliable partner. In 2013, when the opposition party won that nearly 45% of the votes, of course, people freaked out. So then he went to the Chinese ambassador and apparently asked, are you going to support us? And the Chinese ambassador said, well, we'll support whoever supports us. So it was a signal to the Prime Minister of Cambodia that actually he's not indispensable. He has to make sure that he wins in order to continue this relationship. And that probably explains why afterwards they tried as hard as they could to essentially control all of the unknown factors in the election. Now, okay, again, why Cambodia and not Laos? Well, actually, I think the strategy is still one of, you've got an organization like ASEAN. You need one country to block it, but you can't be sure that one country will always do what you tell it to do. So you're going to have other countries as well, just as in case, etc. And that has, I think, been China's strategy as well, to essentially bring on board a couple of other countries that clearly are going to do China's bidding, but not perhaps to the extent of Cambodia. Maybe they can be relied upon as a backup, but not as the ringleader in that sense. Freedom has been confined in such a way now that even a couple of years ago, the only place you could protest were in locations that were designated as Freedom Park, for example. So protest isn't anymore wherever you want it to be. You can't even ask permission for it. You have to go to these parks. And then now they're not even giving permission to protest there. So it's very difficult to see how in a country that has a legacy of genocide where a quarter of the population was killed, to then tell people, you should go out there and start a revolution because you're going to end up dead. It's fascinating. One of the things I looked at in my book was a case in which in 2006 there were some people who were arrested, including the current opposition leader who was in prison. He wasn't then an opposition leader. He was head of a human rights NGO. But there were people from, let's say, democracy promotion agencies, which are, you fill in the blank. They were trying to portray the fact that this guy was in a prison cell that had a TV in which he shared it with another guy who was like a human trafficker or basically a pimp. That this was going to be, they needed to promote this so that Cambodians wouldn't be afraid to go to prison because they could see that this one guy was under conditions that didn't seem terrible. And that's really, I thought, this is so crazy. It's an American saying this. He can take a plane anytime and fly out, and he's basically promoting the idea that, you should go out into the streets and be more agitated about this situation. And so, it's okay if you go to prison, you might have a TV in your cell. Meanwhile, the other people were in cells with like 30 people with tuberculosis, and it was not pretty at all. So the reality is, I cannot believe the irresponsibility sometimes of how some of the promoters of those color revolutions were talking back in the mid-2000s, and then now, of course, they're not doing that now, but of course the government is talking about color revolution all of a sudden, which is like, wait, you're about 10 years behind when you should have been talking about this. Yeah, so 2013, yes, there were protests because they couldn't agree. The opposition would not join the National Assembly because they disputed the outcome of the election, even at 45% of the vote. They thought that the election had been stolen from them. It's a possibility. Of course, the evidence is probably already destroyed if there was any. And so there were protests. It led to 4 deaths of garment workers who were ensnared in a reaction from the authorities, shooting into crowds. And of course, that was really a very defining moment for a lot of people who thought they could actually deal with the current government. So Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, for example, who had up until then been more or less quiet about what was going on in Cambodia, immediately decided that this was the turning point. He could not accept anymore this situation happening in Cambodia, and he started speaking out against Prime Minister Hun Sen. Well, let's see. I'm not seeing that right now, and I think that the main point has been they are now going into there's some group that is going to bomb some place in Phnom Penh or something, and then we've got to, there's insecurity or there's going to be terrorism of some kind, and so I would expect that there'd be arrests from that. The director of the film, Who Killed Chia Vichia, who was a labor leader, he was essentially told that he's a CIA agent, which I think is fascinating because, of course, Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, has a long history of labeling people CIA, KGB, whatnot. So they're just reverting to this kind of like labeling people and saying hey, he's out there promoting color revolution and so on. Thankfully, he's not in Cambodia, but he is in Turkey, which is another problem place. But the rise of populist authoritarianism, authoritarian populism is a problem, as I've mentioned, really throughout Asia and other parts of the world. It's fascinating. All right, so you had in Georgia and Ukraine these color revolutions, right? The Orange Revolution, the Yellow Revolution, I don't know. It's all these names, various colors. And basically, they resulted in regime change or in leaders being toppled. And so the concern by the Cambodian authorities is that they believe that what's happening in Cambodia is an attempt by the West to promote color revolution there. But of course, what does it mean? How does one actually unpack the term? There was an NGO leader who said, well, she doesn't know what color revolution means, but she knows what people power movement means. And if you consider that to be the same thing, then all it is that people are rising up and saying they want to have the democracy that has been taken from them. So it's really a situation in which I think, they've branded this term. If you want to read it, there's that report from which I quoted the Prime Minister's fake democracy statement. That's their position about what color revolution. They needed 98 pages to explain color revolution and why it is bad for Cambodia. And I told the press at the time that, if you need this many pages, somebody is working overtime to try to explain a term to use it as a reason for why people need to be stopped. And that's, of course, not a good situation. Oh, yes, that one is in English. The Khmer version is 132 pages. So the English version, and please drop me a line, I'll send it to you. I'm actually trying to, it's images. So I've PDF'd it, and then I've OCR'd it, and I was going to upload it to turn it in to find out where they plagiarized most of that stuff. So, actually, and my subscription to turn it in has just expired, so I can't actually upload it. So if anybody has access, I would love to see the results of the originality report on that. Before he passed away, there was already an abdication and succession of the current king in place. So his name is King Sihamoni. He's a former ballet dancer trained in Czechoslovakia. He has no heirs, no children. So it's really very interesting. I think what's happening is that the power center that used to be the moral authority of the king has more or less shifted to the point where it's gone. I mean, he doesn't really come out and say anything that's provocative or controversial. Even royal decrees apparently are no longer even signed personally. They have a stamp for his signature, and so it's very difficult to imagine a situation in which he could speak out and be able to say, hey, I don't think you should be doing this dissolving the opposition party. This is not right for our democracy. There are too many limits on his ability to speak. The irony is that a few weeks ago they passed the lèse majesté law, so they're copying Thailand in terms of not being able to say anything about the monarchy, and that's in the context of what exactly? There's nothing actually going on in which one would want to say anything at all, so it's very strange, but I think it's just more reason for when there might be an opportunity to find a pretext for arresting somebody for having said something that they don't like. And the Prime Minister himself has portrayed this idea, or has been promoting the idea, that he is the reincarnation of someone known as Lai Khan, who lived centuries ago and was a commoner who became king for a while in Cambodia. So it's a narrative as if the Prime Minister, it's just like, I would argue, Hugo Chavez wanting to be the reincarnation of Simón Bolívar, and so many other instances of this kind of thinking where you try to anoint yourself with the idea that you have some sort of mystical, supernatural power of some kind. Well, all right, from a political economy perspective, the TPP was supposed to improve global or GDP for the member countries, at least on the US side, by maybe a fraction of a percent over the course of like a decade or some such. So it's not the end of the world that you're not part of TPP, but what did it represent? It represents a string of trade deals that are about what? About improving standards when you trade with another country. So if you only care about tariffs and saying, okay, we just want to lower our tariffs so that we can trade for as little as possible in terms of transaction costs, then you don't actually set any kind of standards with respect to labor, right? So the idea there with the TPP was, okay, if they want to trade with the U.S., they need to, all these members of TPP would have to sign on the dotted line and promise to uphold like independent labor union rights, as opposed to what goes on, for example, in Vietnam, where there are basically no independent unions, right? So they're all controlled by the government, and so what they say is not actually what the workers want. They're used to actually probably suppress workers, and it's happening increasingly in Cambodia as well, where labor unions in Cambodia are now being co-opted. Some, I hear, by the tune of $10,000 a month to the leader of the union to essentially do whatever the authorities want them to do. Meanwhile, the real unions are harassed and followed and can't do their work. So for a deal like TPP would have been good if the standards are kept high and the members of that trade arrangement then abide by those standards. So I actually think it's a good thing, as opposed to saying we don't care about standards of environment, like how things are produced or how labor is treated or how intellectual property, which is the real big benefit for the U.S., is respected. So recently Cambodia essentially said that it would respect Chinese patents as, like patents issued in China would be respected in Cambodia. So that's a signal again that Cambodia is saying, well, we're just like an extension of China, where we agree that your discoveries, your inventions are perfectly are to be respected here in Cambodia. And if they said the same thing about U.S. patents, for example, that would also be an improvement, but they haven't done that. Right. Well, so okay, on the land titling, yes. What happened was, I think Hun Sen decided that this issue of land grabbing, this issue of insecure property rights, it's becoming too much of a problem. People are protesting all the time. So he sent out these kind of youth brigades to go and issue land titles, and they issued like something like 400,000 land titles. But the places where there was any sort of conflict over who actually owned the land were completely ignored, and so all that did was to essentially, help those who already had, who didn't have any disputes to begin with. So that's good for them. But for those who actually had their lands taken or were at risk of having their lands taken, that did nothing for them. And then as to the Chinese companies, I don't know, but I tend to think that the golden rule applies in Cambodia. Whoever has the gold makes the rules, and so these Chinese companies continue to essentially extract incredible concessions, and a lot of this is through what are called economic concessions. So you're not supposed to actually, you're not taking over the land, but you can exploit the land's economic value, and that can mean things like, oh, let's just, okay, so we're supposed to grow something here, but let's just go and log the entire forest and also the nearby forests so that we can claim those trees came from our land that was logged here, and result in tremendous windfalls. And then after they're done with that, they actually don't do anything with the land. So it's terrible.